The waiting room was quiet in a way that made every sound feel louder than it should have. The hum of the old fluorescent lights, the shuffle of paperwork, the cough someone tried to hide behind their hand. I sat in a hard plastic chair at the county assistant's office, holding a thin folder against my chest like it might disappear if I loosened my grip. The folder wasn't heavy, just a few forms, a copy of my marriage certificate, a letter about my benefits that used words I didn't fully understand. Still, it felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. Across from me, a woman younger than my daughter scrolled on her phone. An older man stared at the floor, his hands folded as if in prayer. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. You learn something after 60. Silence isn't empty. It's full of people who've learned not to ask for too much. A police called a name I didn't recognize. Someone stood. Someone else sat down. Time moved, but not forward, just around us. I looked down at my hands. They were neat, clean, still capable. Hands that had cooked thousands of meals, signed permission slips, held my husband's hand through promotions and disappointments and long, quiet nights when we didn't know how to talk anymore. Hands that used to matter. The sign on the wall said, "Please have patience." I wondered when patience turns into invisibility. No one here knew who I used to be, and I didn't volunteer the information. I didn't say that I'd been married for 36 years, that I'd helped build a life that looked solid from the outside, that I once handled paperwork that decided other people's futures. Now, I was here because a letter arrived in the mail with a sentence that ended in a question mark. You may no longer be eligible. That question mark had kept me awake for 3 nights. I wasn't angry. I wasn't dramatic. I was tired. Tired in the way women get tired when they've been useful for so long that no one notices when they're not anymore. The clerk finally called my name. I stood up, smoothing my sweater out of habit. And as I walked toward the desk, one thought stayed with me. Quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. I wasn't here to ask for sympathy. I was here to understand how my life had been rewritten without my permission. While the clerk tapped at her keyboard, I drifted somewhere else. Not far, just backward. I remembered a version of myself that didn't need to explain why she belonged in a room. I got married young, not reckless young, just hopeful. Back then, people still believed marriage was something you built, not something you upgraded when it stopped feeling convenient. My husband had plans, big ones. I had plans too, but mine were quieter. I learned early that someone had to be practical. Someone had to remember birthdays, keep receipts, pack lunches, smooth over bad days, and say, "We'll figure it out," even when we didn't know how. That someone was usually me. I worked when I needed to. I stayed home when it made sense. I followed him when his job moved. I paused my ambitions the way women of my generation were taught to. Not as a sacrifice, but as a responsibility. I didn't feel cheated at the time. I felt necessary. People thanked him for his success. They nodded politely at me, and that was enough. Or at least I told myself it was. I was the one who noticed when the bills changed, the one who caught mistakes before they became problems, the one who signed forms he didn't read and trusted me to handle. He used to say, "You're better at that stuff." And I believed him. Not because I was naive, but because trust, once established, becomes invisible. You don't examine it every day, you live inside it. 36 years went by like that. Not unhappy, not perfect, just steady. By the time our children were grown, our conversations were mostly logistical. Who was picking up groceries? What needed fixing? Which appointment was next? Love didn't disappear, it thinned. And when it finally ended, it didn't explode. It folded, quietly. Later, people would ask me if I'd seen it coming. I always gave the same answer. No, because erasure doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives one small decision at a time, until one day you realize your name is missing from places it used to be written without question. The day my marriage ended didn't look like the movies. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no final speech that explained everything. It was a Tuesday. He stood in the bedroom holding a small stack of papers. Not clothes, not memories, just documents. He said he'd already spoken to a lawyer. Said it the way you say you've already called the plumber. As information, not emotion. He told me we'd grown apart. That phrase always sounded so harmless, like drifting clouds, like no one was steering. He said he wanted peace. He said we both deserved a fresh start. And then he said something I still hear clearly. You'll be fine. He said it kindly, almost gently, as if 36 years of shared life could be reduced to reassurance. I didn't cry at first. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened while he explained how things would work. The accounts, the house, the paperwork he'd already taken care of. He used words I recognized but hadn't learned to question. Assets, beneficiaries, future considerations. He said there was no reason to worry, that everything was fair. And because I had trusted him with every ordinary day of my adult life, I trusted him with this too. When he left, he didn't take much. A suitcase, a box of books, his good jacket. The house stayed quiet after the door closed. Not empty, just unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else now. That night, I slept on my side of the bed out of habit. In the morning, I made coffee for two before remembering there was only one of me left to drink it. People assume the worst part of divorce is the loneliness. It isn't. The worst part is realizing that the person who knew all your routines also knew exactly how to dismantle your life without raising his voice. Months later, I signed papers I didn't fully understand because I didn't want to prolong the process. I didn't want bitterness. I didn't want conflict. I wanted closure. What I didn't realize then was this. Closure only works when the truth is complete. And mine wasn't. Life doesn't collapse all at once. It shrinks. At first, nothing looked different from the outside. I still woke up early, still folded laundry the same way, still wrote grocery lists on the same pad by the phone. But decisions started changing. I moved out of the house we'd shared for decades, not because I wanted to, but because it made financial sense. That was the phrase everyone used. Financial sense. It sounded responsible. It felt like surrender. I rented a small place, one bedroom, thin walls, the kind where you learn your neighbors' schedules without ever meeting them. I downsized my belongings the way people do after a death, slowly, carefully, deciding what still mattered. Some friends stayed in touch, others drifted away. Couples don't always know where to place a woman who's suddenly alone. I understood. Or at least I told myself I did. Money became something I managed instead of something I planned. I stopped thinking in years and started thinking in months. Doctor appointments got spaced out. Small indulgences disappeared. I learned which grocery items were flexible and which weren't. I didn't feel poor, I felt cautious, and cautious becomes a habit. My children called when they could. They had lives, families, pressures of their own. I didn't want to be another responsibility on their list, so I said I was fine. Most of the time, that wasn't a lie, but sometimes in the evenings I'd sit at the small kitchen table and realize that everything I'd been, wife, partner, planner, support, had no place to land anymore. There was no role for it, no acknowledgement, just silence. I didn't resent my ex-husband. Not yet. I assumed the life I was living now was simply the cost of choices I'd made long ago. Marriage, trust, putting someone else first. It never occurred to me that something had been taken, only that something had ended. And that belief, that nothing had been stolen, is what allowed the truth to stay hidden for so long. The clerk didn't look alarmed when she paused. She just frowned slightly, the way people do when something doesn't line up on a screen. She clicked her mouse once, then again. "Can you give me a moment?" she said, already turning toward the printer. I nodded. Waiting had become second nature. When she returned, she held a single sheet of paper. Just one. She placed it between us on the desk and pointed to a line halfway down the page. "I'm not saying this is wrong," she said carefully, "but it's unusual." The word sat there, quiet but heavy. Unusual. I leaned forward and adjusted my glasses. It was a record. Old, dated years back, a financial designation tied to my marriage timeline, something that should have included my name. It didn't. I stared at the blank space where my name should have been. It wasn't dramatic. No red flags, no bold warnings, just absence. The clerk explained that sometimes documents get updated, beneficiaries change, accounts shift. It happens all the time. But her voice softened when she added, "Given the length of your marriage, I would expect something different." I didn't argue. I didn't panic. I felt something colder. I asked her to print a copy. She hesitated, then nodded. As she handed it to me, she said quietly, "You might want to have someone look at this, just to be sure." I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my folder. For the first time since the divorce, I didn't feel tired. I felt alert. On the bus ride home, I unfolded the paper again and again, reading the same lines as if repetition might change them. Dates I recognized, language I trusted, and a signature that wasn't mine. I thought about all the times I'd signed things without reading closely because I believed the person beside me would never do something that required suspicion. I thought about how trust doesn't disappear when it's broken. It just stops protecting you. That night, I placed the paper on my kitchen table and sat across from it for a long time. Not angry, not shocked. Just finally understanding that the life I'd been living since the divorce wasn't the result of bad luck, or aging, or sacrifice. It was the result of a decision made quietly, long before I ever knew to question it. It took time to understand what that paper meant. Not hours, weeks. I brought it to a legal aid office, not a private attorney, not a dramatic consultation, just a woman in a small room with a stack of files and a tired smile who asked me to start from the beginning. So I did. I told her about the marriage, the divorce, the trust I'd placed in someone else to handle things. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me a question that landed harder than anything else. Did you ever review the final versions of these documents yourself? I shook my head. She explained slowly, carefully, the way people do when they don't want to sound accusatory. Years before the divorce, certain assets had been restructured, not illegally, not secretly, just quietly. Beneficiaries updated, ownership clarified, language adjusted. Everything done with enough time and patience that it wouldn't raise alarms. He planned for the possibility of leaving, she said gently, long before he actually did. The words felt clinical. They were anything but. I thought back to that period. The late nights at his desk, the meetings he said I didn't need to attend, the documents he asked me to sign while standing in the doorway, already halfway out. I had trusted him not because I was careless, but because our entire life had been built on the assumption that we were on the same side. The legal aid worker didn't call it betrayal. She called it strategy. She didn't take what was yours, she said. She made sure you wouldn't notice what wasn't there anymore. I nodded, because suddenly, everything made sense. Why the settlement had felt smaller than expected, why the future I'd been told was secure had required so much caution, why I'd been shrinking my life instead of rebuilding it. There was no dramatic crime, no confrontation yet, just the realization that I hadn't been left unprepared by accident. I had been outplanned. And the most unsettling part wasn't the money. It was understanding that the man I'd shared a bed with for decades had trusted time to do the work for him, to age me, to tire me, to make me less likely to ask questions. When I left the office, I didn't cry. I walked home slowly, holding the folder against my chest, thinking one clear thought. He didn't count on me finding this. And now that I had, the rest of my life didn't have to be built around his silence anymore. He didn't come back angry. That's what surprised me. He called first, said he'd been meaning to check in. His voice sounded the same, calm, reasonable, almost familiar enough to make me forget why I felt my shoulders tighten when I heard it. We met at a coffee shop near the old neighborhood. Neutral ground. He looked older, not frail, just smaller somehow, less certain. He smiled when he saw me, the polite smile people use when they don't know what to expect. We talked about ordinary things at first. Weather, the kids, a mutual acquaintance who'd retired. Then he leaned back in his chair and said it. "I hear you've been asking questions." There was no accusation in his tone, just observation. I nodded. He sighed lightly, as if disappointed in something I couldn't see. "You know," he said, "I never meant for things to turn out this way." I didn't respond. Silence does more work than anger ever could. He explained that decisions had been made for stability, that it wasn't personal, that he assumed I'd be fine because I was always good at managing. Good at managing. The same words years later. He suggested we could keep things simple, avoid stress, avoid lawyers, avoid reopening old wounds. He said, at our age, peace matters more than being right. That's when I finally spoke. I told him I'd seen the documents. Just that. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just a flicker, a calculation. He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "those things were handled legally." I agreed. "I know. That's why I'm not here to argue." That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He leaned forward. "So what do you want?" It was the first honest question he'd asked me in years. I looked at him, really looked, and realized something important. He wasn't afraid of consequences. He was afraid of exposure, of things being named, of the story being told accurately. I want the record corrected, I said. That's all. He studied me, searching for leverage that wasn't there anymore. I thought you wouldn't want the trouble, he said quietly. I met his eyes. I've already lived with the trouble. I'm just done carrying it alone. After that meeting, nothing happened right away. No phone calls, no letters, no sudden confrontations. Just time. And time is where the real decisions get made. I had options. The legal aid worker explained them clearly. I could accept a small correction quietly, an adjustment that would improve my situation without disturbing anyone else, or I could insist on a full review, formal, documented, slow. The second option came with effort, with stress, with the risk of being labeled difficult. Women my age are very familiar with that word. For days, I carried the folder with me from room to room. I placed it on the kitchen table while I drank my morning tea. I set it beside me while I watched the evening news. I wasn't afraid of losing. I was afraid of becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who needed permission to exist comfortably. I thought about how easily I'd accepted explanations in the past, how often I'd chosen peace over clarity, not because I was weak, but because I believed harmony was my responsibility. That belief had shaped my entire adulthood, and now it was asking to shape the rest of my life. I realized something then. This wasn't about money. It was about language, about whose version of events became official. Silence would mean agreeing with a story where my absence was accidental. Speaking up would mean correcting the record, even if no one applauded. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies. I wanted my name back in the places it should have been all along. So I made the call. I told the legal aid office I wanted to proceed, fully. When I hung up the phone, my hands were steady. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't reacting to something someone else had decided. I was choosing. Justice doesn't arrive with noise. It comes in envelopes, in scheduled calls, in corrected lines of text. The review took months. There were forms to complete, records to request, dates to verify. No one raised their voice. No one took sides. They simply followed the trail that had been laid years earlier. And when they did, the story changed. The documents were amended, not dramatically, not publicly, but accurately. Assets that had been listed as singular were acknowledged as shared. Benefits that had been calculated narrowly were recalculated properly. It didn't make me wealthy. It made me stable. That difference mattered more than I expected. My ex-husband didn't call again. There were no apologies, no explanations, only silence. The same silence I'd lived with for years, now finally turned in my favor. I realized something important then. People who rely on silence as protection are rarely prepared for records that speak. With the adjustments in place, I made changes slowly. I moved to a slightly better apartment, nothing extravagant, just quieter. I scheduled the doctor appointments I'd been postponing. I stopped counting groceries quite so carefully. I didn't tell many people what had happened. There was no need. The relief was internal. One afternoon, as I organized the folder one last time, I noticed how thin it had become. The paper that once felt heavy now felt ordinary. That's how you know something has lost its power. Not when it's destroyed, but when it no longer defines you. I wasn't vindicated. I was corrected. And that correction gave me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. A future that no longer required me to shrink. People sometimes ask me if I feel angry now. I don't. Anger requires energy, and I've learned how precious that is. My life isn't dramatic. I wake up early because my body still remembers routine. I drink my coffee by the window. I keep my calendar modest. 1 or 2 things a day, never more. I help my daughter when I can, not by rescuing, but by listening. I'm careful not to confuse support with control. That lesson came late, but it came. I live alone now, not lonely, just self-contained. I know exactly what I need, and just as importantly, what I don't. I don't need approval. I don't need permission. I don't need silence to feel safe. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before everything changed, the one who believed being agreeable was the same as being secure, the one who trusted that fairness would appear on its own. I don't judge her. She did the best she could with the information she had. What I know now is simple. A life doesn't disappear just because someone else stops seeing it. Worth doesn't expire with age, and dignity doesn't require witnesses. The truth has a way of surfacing, not loudly, not quickly, but eventually. And when it doesn't always bring celebration. Sometimes it brings something better, peace. I didn't get my youth back. I didn't rewrite my past, but I did reclaim something that had been misplaced for a very long time. My name, my voice, my place in my own story. And at this stage of life, that is more than enough.